Hello friends, what's up? Let us continue our lesson number 15. This is the second video. And in the previous video, we started discussing about the balance of payment crisis of 1991. We saw what were the reasons behind the balance of payment crisis and what was the economic background behind this, right? Like what was happening in the economy, what was the fiscal deficit, what was current account deficit, how were our imports and exports, and so many different things, what were the public debt, etc. So we know that after the balance of payment crisis of 1991, our Indian economy brought in a lot of economic reforms, and those reforms are very famously known as LPG reforms: liberalization, privatization, and globalization. Okay. So we will study about what reforms were brought in 1991. So in this particular video, we are going to start about it, right? Or we are going to study about the economic reforms after 1991 crisis. So the reforms of 1991 are often seen as a response to the balance of payment crisis. Okay, see, most of the people and even common people, they say that because there was a balance of payment crisis in 1991, as a response to this crisis, we brought in the 1991 reforms. But in fact, they were a response to two distinct challenges. Okay, so in fact, the reform process was not just to address the balance of payment crisis. It was not just for the BOP crisis, but it was for two major challenges in the Indian economy. Okay, apart from balance of payment crisis, there was another challenge that was going on. So one challenge was obviously the balance of payment crisis, immediate response to it. So the reforms were kind of immediate response to this. And there was another challenge which was a chronic challenge to the Indian economy. Okay, it was a chronic, meaning it was an old challenge ever since our independence, right from the 1950 onwards. That challenge had been there, and that challenge is known as the challenge of slow growth. Oh, okay, our GDP growth rate was very, very slow. So if you average our GDP growth, if you average the GDP growth of our country, just before the 1980s, you will see that our growth rate was very, very slow compared to other East Asian countries. And that slow growth was coined as the Hindu rate of growth. Okay, so that slow growth, okay, in the pre-liberalization era, that is from 1950 to 1980s on, up to 1980s, there was a slow growth in the Indian economy, extremely slow, about 3 to 3.5% growth rate on an average. And this slow growth rate was known as Hindu rate of growth. Okay, people called it Hindu rate of growth to refer to certain Indian policies and Indian mindset at that time. So it was a little bit derogatory terminology, okay, to call a slow growth rate to be the Hindu growth rate. It was a derogatory thing for our country, for the Hindu people, and for the Indian economy. But that is how it was there at that time. And this term was coined in 1978 by Professor Raj Krishna. Okay, Professor Raj Krishna was an Indian economist, and I think he was working in Delhi School of Economics at that time. And he referred to the slow growth of India as the Hindu rate of growth. So he was the person who gave this name in 1978. And what is the meaning of Hindu rate of growth? The meaning of Hindu rate of growth is that it refers to the low, that is around 3.5% average growth rate of Indian economy in the pre-liberalization era. Okay. Hindu, why was it called Hindu rate of growth? Because it referred to our inward looking socialist economic policies with high state control, license and inspector raj, and high population growth. Okay, so it was something very very much applicable to India as a country at that time, that we were inward looking, we were not looking what the other countries are doing outside, we were happy in our own space. We were having socialist economic policies, a tilt towards the socialism, because we were very much influenced by the Russia and USSR. So because of the welfareistic state, we were not able to have a capitalist kind of economy. Expansion of the businesses, etc., was not very freely done in our country at that time. So there was very high state control, licensing raj was there. You needed to have license for each and everything. If you want to import something, you need license. If you want to export something, you need license. Okay, there was a lot of inspector raj also. Okay, inspector raj meaning, there was a lot of harassment of by the bureaucracy for the business people. And high population growth also. Our population growth was very high compared to our GDP growth. So what happens when your population growth is more than your GDP growth? Your per capita income growth is very less, right? Per capita income growth is very less, because say it's a very simple fact that if your GDP is growing by say 5%, and if your population is growing, your population is growing by 10%, then your GDP per capita, that is GDP divided by population, okay, GDP per population is not growing as same as the rate of growth of GDP 5%. It will grow at half the pace, because population is growing at the double the rate. Okay, population is growing by double rate. So that is there. So that why it was called the Hindu rate of growth. And recently in the news also it was mentioned that Raghuram Rajan, our ex RBI governor, mentioned that India currently is also very dangerously close to the Hindu rate of growth, and a lot of people criticized it also. You can read it in the newspaper. It was in the current affairs very recently. Now, what was the backdrop before the reforms were undertaken? Okay, let us understand the political scenario in our country, what was happening. We have discussed about it in the previous video, but let us go through it again, okay, a little bit. So, problems began to surface in the last years of the Rajiv Gandhi government, okay, widening of current account deficit. So, our current account deficit was increasing, and we know that it was about 3.5% of GDP in 1990-91 that year. And this problem had started in the last year of Rajiv Gandhi government itself, okay. Right from the 1989 itself, this problem had started to surface. In 1989, elections were due. Okay, elections were about to happen in 1989, and government did not take any coercive and hard steps. So even though in 1989 we saw that this kind of economic situation is coming, but government could not take any hard or difficult measures, because that was the election year. So usually during the election year, the government will not take any difficult economic decision, because it can be politically bad for them. Okay, so they could not take those kind of steps. So then VP Singh government came. Okay, VP Singh was our prime minister for some time, and he was preoccupied with other issues. Okay, so he did not pay heed, he did not pay attention to the issues of balance of payment crisis in our country that was coming up. So early signs were ignored, they could not see it. And instead of that, he announced the OBC reservations. Okay, so because of these OBC reservations, again there were a lot of student protests in our country. And see, whenever protests are happening, businesses will not happen, economy will come to a halt. So a lot of student protest was happening, unrest was there, political instability was there, and all those things were there, and therefore we could not pay attention to the emerging crisis, that was the BOP crisis. Then VP Singh resigned. After VP Singh resigned, Chandrasekhar government came. Okay, Chandrasekhar became our prime minister, and he started negotiations with the IMF, because see, whenever a balance of payment crisis situation occurs, we know that IMF comes in and it gives loan to the country for fighting the balance of payment crisis, to sustain the currency. But at the same time, IMF will ask you to do a lot of reforms also. Okay, so they are the conditional loans, they are not unconditional loans, but IMF loans come with conditions to take difficult decisions. Okay, and Chandrasekhar government could not take those decisions. He was too weak to commit to such actions. His government failed in 1991 and general elections were called. Okay, so again he could not very successfully fight against the BOP crisis, because he was too weak, his government was too weak to commit to these decisions to bring about very difficult economic reforms in the country. Then came the Congress-led coalition government under the PV Narasimha Rao. Okay, in 1991 a new government was formed, which was a coalition government led by Congress. And first priority was given to deal with the balance of payment crisis. So PV Narasimha Rao's first priority was given to BOP crisis. Manmohan Singh was the finance minister of PV Narasimha Rao, and then they brought about all these policies. Strong actions were taken with lot of reforms. BOP crisis was taken as an opportunity to deeper structural reforms. Okay, see, since our growth rate was very slow, Okay, growth rate had always been very less. We needed to bring about structural reforms in the economy. Okay, structural reforms like changing the licensing Raj and Inspector Raj and import licensing and even the FEMA and FERA rules. Okay, FEMA and FERA rules. So all those things. So FERA Act was Foreign Exchange Regulatory Act. It was changed to FEMA. Okay, all after the balance of payment crisis only. So we changed a lot of things and structural reforms were brought in into our country. Now let us look at what were the reforms exactly, what reforms were brought. So the very first thing, as we know that the balance of payment crisis was facing us right in our in front of us. It was there in the month of June 1991. We know that our import cover was only 3 weeks at that time. So this was the peak of our crisis, June 1991. Immediately what happened, the government decided that we will not stick. So at that time, if you remember, I told you that India was having a fixed exchange rate regime, but now that see, you cannot sustain that exchange rate, your currency, because you don't have forex reserves. So you will have to devalue your currency. So Manmohan Singh, our finance minister, he decided to devalue our currency in 2 stages. Please try to remember this is very important. Our currency was devalued, rupee was devalued in 2 stages. Okay, at that time the first devaluation was on 1st of July 1991, and the second devaluation was after 2 days, 3rd July 1991. On 1st July, our currency was devalued by 7 to 9%, and on 3rd July, it was further devalued by 11%. So total about 20% devaluation of our currency was allowed by the government. So what happened, that Manmohan Singh, he called the RBI governor. At that time, I think C. Rangarajan was the RBI governor. So Manmohan Singh called him on phone and he told him that we are going to devalue it on 1st of July. So 1st of July, they devalued. Then what happened after the devaluation? Obviously, see, if the rupee is falling, it is a kind of political, it will have political backlash also. So the prime minister at that time, P.V. Narasimha Rao, P.V. Narasimha Rao thought that it will bring a bad name to my government, that I am devaluing the rupee, and in my time the rupee is getting devalued. So basically, he then, what happened, on the morning of 3rd of July, he called Manmohan Singh, his finance minister, and told him that you stop another devaluation, don't devalue it for the second time on 3rd July. But Manmohan Singh said that no sir, it is very important, we have to devalue our currency further by 11%, otherwise we will not be able to get the IMF loans and we will not be able to fight this crisis. But P.V. Narasimha Rao told him that no, nothing doing, I don't want it, please stop it. Then what happened, Manmohan Singh, within himself, inside, he wanted that the currency to be devalued. But then since it is order of the prime minister and prime minister does not want it, so he immediately called RBI governor C. Rangarajan on 3rd July morning at 9:30 a.m. Okay, he called him and he told him that okay, you stop the devaluation, don't do it. But Rangarajan told him that sir, we have already devalued our currency at 9 a.m. in the morning. Okay, you are half an hour late and I am sorry. So within himself, Manmohan Singh was happy that the currency got devalued. But then this is the backstory of this. Just I wanted to share with you that these kind of things happened, that just half an hour later Manmohan Singh called. If he had called him some 1 hour before, half an hour before, this maybe this devaluation would not have happened. So see, this is how the history takes place. This is how the economic history unfolds itself. So devaluation of rupee, this was the first thing that we did. This was the immediate response. Then liberalization of trade policy. We liberalized our trade policy. Almost all intermediate and capital goods which earlier needed an import license were allowed to be freely tradable against the exim scribes. Okay, so consumer good import was still banned. So initially, if you want to import anything, you needed license, and consumer good import was banned in our country at that time. But what happened during this liberalization phase? In the first phase, what they did, they first of all they allowed intermediate and capital goods to come, basically the raw materials and capital goods, meaning the machinery, etc., to come into our country freely without import licensing, and they can be freely tradable against the exim scribes. We know what is exim scribes, right? You can go back to our international economic policy lesson and you can see what are those. But still in 1991 when this policy was brought in, consumer good was still banned, and later on it was liberalized. Okay, later on we allowed so many different kind of free trade in different commodities. That list is there. And we also allowed FDI, foreign direct investment, in so many different sectors, right? So that is known as basically liberalization and globalization. Okay, liberalization of trade and globalization, meaning we are trying to integrate within the global value chains. We are trying to attract the foreign investments. Okay, and a lot of privatization also happened. We know that the government sold the SBI shares at that time, and 100. So I think currently as government holds only 60% of SBI, or 57% of SBI, but at that time government was holding 100%. So it privatized some of the shares of the private sector, public sector banks also, and a lot of government institutions were privatized at that time. So that policy is known as privatization. So that is why this entire reform is known as LPG reforms. Now exim scripts were freely tradable. It led to a market mechanism to limit imports rather than deliberate policy. Okay, so previously there was a deliberate policy of restricting the imports. There were quantitative controls, and there were trade licensing and quotas given for importing. But now since you have opened it to a market, if there is a free market, so there will be a demand and supply of the exim scribes. So obviously wherever the demand and supply curve will intersect, that will be the free market quantity and price of that exim scribes. So this is market mechanism automatically controls the imports, because beyond this there will be no demand and supply of that point in the free market. So that kind of free market policy in exim scribes was adopted. 1993 currency regime was changed to managed float. Okay, so after 2 years then we changed to managed float kind of currency regime. We already know what is managed float. It is also known as dirty floating or managed floating. Okay, so mechanism: excess import demand would lead to depreciation of rupee, which in turn would make our exports competitive. Okay, so this managed floating meaning what? If you are if your currency is is depreciating because of excessive imports, so now this depreciation will in turn will increase our export competitiveness also, right? See, if currency is depreciating, if rupee is falling, that means your imports are costly. Imports are costlier and exports are cheaper, correct? So if your exports are cheaper, meaning your exports will increase, imports are costly, meaning imports will go down, automatically your trade balance will improve, your current account deficit will reduce. So that was the mechanism. But this is only possible when you allow rupee to depreciate. Okay, when you allow rupee to float, correct? So that was the mechanism that was adopted. In 1991, there was one Chelia committee also. So Chelia committee suggested tax reforms covering both direct and indirect taxes, okay, and which were implemented over 3 years. See, basically we wanted to revive our manufacturing industry. We wanted to revive our private sector. Now, whenever you want to revive your private sector, you have to give them tax incentives. You want to give people incentive to work. And what is the biggest tax and what is the biggest incentive? The biggest incentive is the tax reforms, right? If you give people, if the corporate taxes are reduced, if the income taxes are reduced, then, people will work more and, they will produce more. So that is how your manufacturing will boost. So what were some of the recommendations of Chelia committee which were implemented over 3 years? So it introduced the marginal tax rates. Okay, marginal tax rates meaning up to 5 lakhs, this will be the tax rate. Then 5 to 10, this will be the tax rate. So this is known as marginal taxation. Okay. Then before that there was no marginal taxation in our country, but it was introduced after the recommendation of Chelia committee. Then quality of tax information was improved. Okay, people now they would receive more tax information, what is pending, what is due, how calculations are made. So there was no opacity when it comes to tax administration. Simplified excise integration and VAT system. Okay, this is indirect taxes. It brought service sector within the VAT. So see, if service sector is brought within the VAT, you can claim your returns. Okay, for example, if you are manufacturing books and you are transporting it, and on transportation you are paying some service VAT. So now you can claim this VAT return. The company can claim this VAT return because it is using the service. So it was integrated into the VAT. Then it reduced the corporate tax rates. Okay, corporate tax rates were reduced to attract investments. Then it reduced domestic duty, it reduced the import duties also, custom duties also. Computerization was adopted so that transparency will increase, and it broadened the tax base. Okay, it aimed at broadening the tax base of our country. Then there was another committee, Rekhi committee in 1992. It was on indirect tax reforms only. So it suggested about tribunal to be set up to deal with disputes between taxpayers and tax collectors. Okay, tax collectors basically. So there was a lot of disputes between the taxpayers and the government departments. So in order to solve this dispute, the Rekhi committee recommended that a tribunal should be set up to deal with these issues, because by normal judiciary they get delayed and they don't get justice. So she recommended about the setting up of a tribunal. Then Kelkar committee on tax reforms. It was in 2002, although much after the BOP crisis. But since we are discussing about tax reforms, it is important to mention about the Kelkar committee also. And Kelkar committee on tax reforms it's on both direct and indirect taxes. What were the recommendations of Kelkar committee? So basically, see, there's some simple recommendation. You don't need to remember. Just try to just understand this what I'm trying to tell you. Income tax exemption limit to be increased from 50k to 1 lakh. Okay, this is an old thing. Then two-tier tax rate system. 20% for 1 lakh to 4 lakh and 30% for 4 lakh above. This was at that time. Okay, at that time 4 lakh income was also very high income. Then abolition of LTCG, long-term capital gain tax, dividend tax, wealth taxes. This was implemented. Okay, this was abolished by the government. Interest subsidy on housing loans. So he said that if people are taking housing loan, we should give them interest subsidy, because that is how your real estate sector will boost. And nationwide VAT and comprehensive service tax system, and these were the roots of GST. Okay, so he said that there should be a nationwide single VAT and service tax system, and these were the germ of the idea of GST. So that is how our GST idea got formed in our country, and it got implemented later in 2017. So I think we'll continue about talking about the reforms. To study this, it will take a lot of time, and from prelims perspective only this much is important. But if you are interested, you can read a lot of books where all this history is given, and what all things took place at that time is given. But we are going to study only the important and important topics which are expected in the exam. Okay, so we'll continue about this in the next video. Thank you.